Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
July, almost the end of the year, it seems, in many respects. Lots of things have happened already. News comes pouring in. It's really difficult to keep up with what's happening. You're with Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and Prashant. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter, running all around the world, trying to keep up with things. Yesterday, or just a few days ago, Peru had a major event in new government a year ago, and so on. Really didn't seem to have the energy, Zoe, to follow what was happening. Bring us up to speed. What's happening with President Pedro Castillo and government in Peru?
Well, it has been 1 year since Pedro Castillo was sworn in, July 28th. A monumentous moment in Peru last year. It came after almost a month of back and forth following the elections. Keiko Fujimori, who was the far-right candidate, was unaccepting of her defeat. There were a lot of different legal maneuvers that the far right attempted to pull to revert the decision of the people in the elections. It was a very drawn out process. And finally, they submitted to the defeat. Pedro Castillo was sworn in, but it hasn't been really happy news since then. It's been a year of intense political turmoil. Pedro Castillo's government, ministers, his cabinet, his party has been essentially engulfed in political crisis after political crisis since this date. Only a week ago, once again, far-right legislators presented another impeachment motion of Pedro Castillo. And so really, it's been a year of intense political instability. Héctor Bejar, who was, the foreign minister, he was one of the first people to be targeted in this campaign of political attacks. These have come in many different, so he was one of the first people who resigned weeks after being sworn in. But since then, Pedro Castillo was forced to reestablish his cabinet 4 times. He's come under several impeachment votes. The latest one, as I said, was brought up last week. And one of the far-right parties, has even introduced a motion, a legislation, a reform that would make it possible for them to pass the impeachment with less votes. So currently in Peru, you need 87 votes in the Congress to pass impeachment. They want to make it 78. So you can really see what length they're going to essentially bring political instability, to make Peru ungovernable. And of course, Pedro Castillo has taken different decisions, which some people don't agree with. His own party has kicked him out. He was resigned from the Peru Libre Party. But all of that is in this context of political turmoil, of constant attacks. Some of the things they accuse him of, it's incredible when he would have even had the time to do it, since he's been under such attacks. And so it's really seemed like this was all premeditated. Of course, when the far right was defeated in the elections, it was clear that they were not going to stand idly by and let the person who promised to create a national constituent assembly, who promised to redistribute the wealth of a country that has so many natural resources, but had been giving all of this wealth to the elites in Peru and to the transnational corporations. It was clear that they were not going to let this go ahead. And we're seeing Peru as a perfect case of what's been happening in many countries in Latin America, where progressive forces are winning these electoral victories. But it is so clear that the power of these economic elites is strong, and that they won't stand by, and that it's clear that these government projects, which involve fundamentally changing society, will be met with resistance.
Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth talks about the granite block. He talks about how there is this granite block that prevents humanity from exerting itself. Yes, there's a granite block in Peru, outrageous oligarchy. There's also a granite block in Egypt. This block suffocating the voice of a very decent person. Prashant, tell us what is happening in Cairo.
Right, of course, we're referring to Alaa Abdel Fattah, who's been in jail for quite some time now, and who, according to latest reports by his family, there's actually suddenly some kind of a blackout with reference to information about him, which is quite alarming because he's actually on a hunger strike. In fact, he was, he began his hunger strike in May, and for the first couple of months was not consuming any food at all and only water, and now is consuming a small amount of food, as his family pointed out, to keep the campaign alive. But what has happened is that in the past few days, we've not been hearing much about him. His family was denied a visit. Apparently, he refused to meet them, is what the officials are saying. There was a letter which he wrote on July the 16th, which was delivered 1 week late. And there's been a spike in concern, both because of his health as well as the fact that he's a political prisoner. We know Alaa Abdel Fattah's story. We talked about this in the show before. Arrested multiple times, and in the most recent instance, sentenced to 5 years in prison on charges as vague as spreading fake news, etc., which is ironic because a lot of his work was actually targeted at, what do you call, spreading awareness about all kinds of political issues, etc., and also taking a strong stand. And he spent multiple years in jail at this point. I think he's barely been free for very long after 2013. There have been continuous series of imprisonments that have taken place. And even in this round has been particularly brutal. In fact, his lawyers had said that his mental state was declining considerably due to the conditions in the prison in which he was kept, after which he was moved to a rehabilitation center. And that's around the time when he began his protest. Now, of course, a lot of activism, a lot of voices being raised in the region, also because his case is emblematic of the way in which Egypt as a whole has treated political prisoners. We know that Egypt has tens of thousands of political prisoners. Last year, the government made some kind of a gesture in which they sort of said they would remove some emergency courts, but key political prisoners continue, to be sentenced, continue to be prison, continue to face accusations such as these, which are quite common. In fact, spreading fake news, spreading, causing unrest against the government, terrorism. All these are such vague accusations thrown against prominent human rights activists. And at this point, there is not even the pretense of trying to build a case against many of these people. Now, equally important to the fact that Alaa Abdel Fattah has recently become a British citizen as well, which has led to his family also asking very tough questions of the British government, because you have, prominent members of the British establishment over the past many months, time and again talking about their concern for human rights, time and again talking about, their framing every global issue that is there in terms of human rights and portraying themselves as champions of this. Whereas when it comes again to their own citizen, Alaa Abdel Fattah, who's been granted citizenship, the UK has been very reluctant to say something. The family's attempts to reach out to Liz Truss, for instance, have not met any success at all. It's kind of ironic because on a very similar note, we see Shireen Abu Akleh's family also meeting Antony Blinken, and then again the US responding with the very typical, vague statements as it is. So, important question, because Egypt is such a vital part of the US and the British NATO and British plans in West Asia. It serves as a very, very important client state, and thus it gets the blank check to do. They continue with these kind of activities, whereas others keep getting the lectures on human rights. So a very alarming situation in some senses. People across the world need to keep track of this one important case also because it is so emblematic. And of course, a couple of months ago, you did an interview with Alaa Abdel Fattah's mother as well, in which she talked about, for instance, what her son's agenda was, what his ideology was, and expressed, despite all this, expressed that sense of hope that there would be, there's no option but change, because the youth will not stand for this for too long. So, yeah.
It's a remarkable family, Prashant. The father was in prison, a lawyer, very respected person, fighter for democracy in Egypt, expanding the social setup in Egypt. Mother is a fierce activist, and that came across in that interview you referenced. Somebody who has been very brave on the streets last 40 years. Sisters, great people of the street, always out there fighting to expand Egyptian democracy. And then, of course, the aunt, Ahad Suaif, also an important person in the worldview of Egypt's democracy. We wish the family a great deal of our wishes and hope that they are able to at least see Alaa Fattah and then, of course, his release. Let's go to Sri Lanka for a few minutes. I know, Prashant, you've been watching this story carefully. We've reported it, of course. There was the great uprising against the Rajapaksa family. Rajapaksa family decamped, some of them to Singapore, others to a naval base, and so on. But events in Sri Lanka should not be forgotten, because things seem to be happening now that require, I think, our consideration. Number one, the man who came back to take over the government, Mr. Wickremesinghe, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has been essentially either prime minister or head of the opposition since 1993. I mean, the man is not, any kind of radical. This is the Sri Lankan ruling class asserting itself, saying, okay, let the Rajapakshas go, but we will maintain authority. And so Wickremesinghe comes in as the head of government. But hey, listen, Rajapakshas go? I don't think so. Interesting to note that Ranil Wickremesinghe his party only has one seat in parliament, and he was rammed through as the head of government by who? The Rajapaksa's party pushed him in. So in a sense, you could say he's a caretaker for the Rajapaksas, but that's not really what I was interested in talking about today. I'm interested in the fact that he has extended the state of emergency. He has used security forces to clear the Galle Face peace camp from which some of these protests had started. In fact, he has been extremely aggressive against any dissident, any protester, and so on. And he has done nothing to actually enable Sri Lanka. 16 IMF deals since it joined the IMF in the 50s, done nothing to help Sri Lanka walk away from this crisis. In fact, it has declared default now. There was a worry about default in 2020. S&P dropped the ratings from B minus to CCC C minus. The lowest level you could have got, that was in December 2020, by the way. And now there's the default. Sri Lanka is in a great crisis. It's a good example, and I'm glad we're doing this story after the Egypt story. It's a good example, again, of mass demonstrations taking place to really rattle the ruling elites. But then when the mass demonstrations not able to convert their demonstration into any kind of political project, the elite simply shuffles the chairs of power. And in fact, in the case of Sri Lanka, as I'm saying, the shuffling was not even that significant, because Mr. Wickremesinghe is an old workhorse of the ruling elites, and in this case, brought to power very much by the Rajapaksas. I wanted to point out one feature of the Sri Lanka story that has not been put on the table much, and that is that according to the World Bank, the two countries in the world with the highest rate of per capita military spending are Israel and Sri Lanka. This is significant. Both of them, in that sense, Sri Lanka, country of 22 million, both of them highly militarized. The areas where there's a Tamil majority population are basically garrisoned till this day, despite the crushing blow that the Rajapaksas inflicted on the Tamil Tigers with enormous casualties, over 100,000 dead and so on. Concentration camps set up, a very ugly scenario. Despite that crushing blow of the Tamil Tigers, they have continued to garrison the Tamil majority areas. So high levels of military spending contribute to this crisis. It's not really been mentioned that much, but I just wanted to put it on the table. A good place to look at, again, at the limitations of popular uprising without a real political project to advance things forward, just as in Egypt. You're listening to Give the People What They Want. What you want from us is as much unvarnished truth as possible. We try our best to give that to you. Don't say we'll always succeed, but gosh, we try hard. We're going to shift gears now to something that's reasonably a similar story where a political project trying desperately to assert itself continually was suffocated. Zoe, take us to Morocco, please.
Well, last weekend, the Democratic Way, which is a Marxist-Leninist organization in Morocco, held its fifth National Congress. And the fact that they even held it in itself was something that's newsworthy, given the tremendous obstacles that were put before them to be able to hold it. They had been trying, they initially were trying to hold it in January 2022, but the regime of King Mohammed V essentially blocked all possibilities for them to hold the conference. There were, rumors to the media that there was going to be criminalization of the party. There were a lot of different efforts underway to essentially block them from doing this. They were not allowed to lease certain venues. They wanted to hold it in a public university, in order to host all of the different people who are involved in the organization, to have this discussion that's so necessary. And they were blocked from all these possibilities. So last weekend, and preceding this weekend, to be honest, they had been consistently denouncing the fact that these public venues were essentially being closed to them with no explanation, no rhyme or reason. But they even protested outside the Ministry of the Interior. This protest was severely repressed by security forces. The Secretary General Brahma, he was attacked, injured. Horrible scenes of repression, of people just asking the question, why aren't we allowed to hold our meeting, which is perfectly legal, perfectly, within our right. But again, they were met with this repression. However, they did hold their conference in Rabat, the capital of Morocco, July 22nd to 24th. The Moroccan Bar Association graciously opened their doors to the organization, and they were able to hold this Congress. And in addition to the Congress itself being held and this being historic in itself, the organization Democratic Way announced that they were launching a new political party to, as you said, Vijay, further this political struggle in this moment where it seems like all doors are closing, where the pillars of democracy are not being respected. However, they have once again challenged the Moroccan regime, what they call the Makhzen, and said, we are going to launch an independent political party for the workers, for the people of Morocco. This is called the Workers' Democratic Way Party. They have professed this in their declaration to be a working class party with socialist and anti-imperialist ideology and characteristics. They have announced that they are going to form a national students union in Morocco. It's a quite exciting statement. I invite people to read the article that we have on our website at People's Dispatch. It links to their original statement. Morocco is often thought about as a tourist destination. A lot of people have been to different cities there, visited the beautiful sites, gone to the markets, don't know that this is kind of upheld by this extremely repressive regime wherein people are, forced to work in very challenging conditions. Many people in Morocco are forced to migrate to Spain. They sustain the agricultural industry there. There's so many different aspects of life of Morocco that have been suffocated by the regime: political participation, political life. Many journalists who are in prison. Human Rights Watch just came out with a report about how the regime has been muffling and silencing dissent. There's cases of different alternative journalists who are currently, similar to Alaa, they're in prison on different charges, but really it's about them speaking the truth, voicing their dissent. And so it's so important that this development has taken place, that there is going to be a new independent working class party. What is going to face them, these challenges, these obstacles, this is huge. They've already been up against this repression, not even being able to access space, but it seems that they're determined, and it will be very important to continue monitoring this situation, continuing to see how the regime responds to this, a regime that recently got a huge support from the United States when they signed the Abraham Agreements to recognize Israel. This is a strengthened Moroccan regime. that has even bigger support behind it. So it's even more important to really strike back in this moment.
That's right. It's a very much a pressing story, particularly given what happened at the border between Spain and Morocco. The death of migrants also reported by People's Dispatch, keeping a close eye at that country. Moving along now, going eastward to Iran. Um, you know, it's like a story, Prashant, that keeps coming back. It's the same story over and over again. Anything new in this story, or must we report the same things over and over again?
Well, the substance is the same again, but the details are always every week there's a fresh detail, and most of these details, unfortunately, tend to be quite depressing for people across the world. The recent being the fact that Brett McGurk, a top U.S. official, has in a briefing told experts that he does not believe that the Iran nuclear deal will be back on track. Now, this comes at a, it's important to note, of course, the statement coming at a time and the larger context in which it's made, because we do know that very recently Joe Biden went to West Asia and had a discussion, of course, landed in Israel first, legitimized Israeli occupation, and then had a discussion with the larger GCC, the GCC Plus group, in which one of the key agendas was to bind all these countries closer to Israel and sort of talk up the threat of Iran as some kind of regional boogeyman, so to speak. So this has really been pretty much the policy of the United States and Israel for the longest time, and there's been stiff opposition from Israel and sections in the US to any attempt to restore the nuclear deal, which is really good for everybody. Because on the one hand, you have the possibility of economic, millions of Iranians whose lives are going to benefit massively when these sanctions are withdrawn, because fundamentally it is about the sanctions more than anything else. And on the other hand, the fact that there is greater discussion around issues of nuclear development, for instance, which is generally good for the world. The possibility of nuclear weapons, say, in the region being used comes down, which is just good everywhere. But despite this being such an obvious deal, the fact is that the US administration has just refused to move on it. Now, experts, for instance, say that Joe Biden, after he promised to come back to the deal, but could have actually done this with an executive order in the very first days of his presidency. The fact is he chose not to because he wanted to get more concessions out of Iran. And Iran, after being pushed to a corner, has even given up one of its demands that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps be removed from the list of terrorist organizations. All it seems to ask is one simple commitment, that the US gives some kind of commitment that it will not abandon the deal again. Now, this is something which the United States is unwilling to give. And it's interesting because we do hear that after the midterm elections in the US in October, that itself could be the Republican-controlled legislature itself could impose restrictions on Biden. And if Republican wins in 2024, we definitely have the US withdrawing from the deal again. So as we've often mentioned in various shows in the past, this really demonstrates how incapable of sticking to treaties the United States has become, and the kind of chaos this is causing across the world, because this is also a region where there are parallel processes on between the UAE and Iran, for instance, even Saudi Arabia and Iran, to try to normalize. Ties may never be great, but at least to try to bring down temperatures. But while this process is going on, there is the US and Israel, which keep raising temperatures in the region, forcing Iran into a position where it will have to say that, we are going to continue uranium enrichment further. So all in all, a very depressing, time for West Asia, because voices which could have, which have been advising very strongly against escalating the conflict are not able to prevail for very good reasons, of course. In the US, it's very good in the sense, very obvious reasons. I mean, not that they're good in any way, but and the impact of this is being borne at one level by millions of Iranians on completely unnecessary sanctions. There's not even a justification for any of them. Point number two, the fact that there is so much now greater tension in the region, talk of war, talks of say escalations of all kinds, and this will also have an effect in so many other rivalries in the region. So keeping all this in mind, very depressing turn of events. There are still talks going on. Of course, Iran has indicated that it is willing to continue with diplomacy, but the Iran nuclear deal itself seems in a very bad place right now.
Terrible news from West Asia, even worse news from East Asia. US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi on her way to Asia. Still not clear whether she will go to Taiwan, although in last that we heard, she plans to arrive in Taiwan. Now, why is this significant? Well, the United States has been, in a sense, poking the Chinese government on many fronts. This is the most recent. In fact, there is now a proposal to do two things with Taiwan. One, cut a $4.5 billion deal with the Taiwanese to go over 4 years, which would be about arms. 4.5 billion, that is no small deal at all. Given that recently there was a controversy over $108 million arms deal between the Biden administration and the government of Taiwan, mostly tanks and so on. That was 108 million. That raised the hackles in Beijing. 4.5 billion, that's another level. Secondly, the United States has indicated that they might very well push for Taiwan to be a non-NATO ally. Very curious development. Not sure if this is entirely necessary. United States already has made all kinds of pledges to Taiwan, but has backed away from them in recent decades, largely as relations between not only Washington and Beijing had improved in the past, but also as relations between Beijing and Taipei had improved in the past. But now they are accelerating the conflict around Taiwan, trying to use Taiwan as an instrument of either humiliating China or setting the stage for a kind of conflict. On Thursday, July 28th, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden spoke for 2 hours. Now, here's the important thing. Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Biden have known each other for decades. They are not strangers. They have known each other, met, have talked many times, and so on. It's interesting. Nancy Pelosi said that she wants to go to Taiwan. The US Pentagon warned that this is not a good idea. In fact, even Joe Biden said this is not a good idea. And yet, Nancy Pelosi, senior member of the government, in a sense, number 3 in line for the throne, is basically disobeying the head of the ticket in her own party. Keep in mind that in 1991, Nancy Pelosi traveled to Beijing in a congressional delegation where they went to Tiananmen Square and unfurled a banner, which talked about democracy in China and so on. She has a history of trying to, as it were, poke the Chinese in the eye. This is very dangerous stuff going on. I'm not saying that, she is not entitled to her opinions and so on. I'm, of course, sure that she is. But on the other hand, does the world need, given that we are already in the middle of a terrible, an ugly confrontation taking place in Ukraine, does the world need another confrontation on the other side of Eurasia at this time? Imagine, with galloping inflation already there in front of people around the world. We already talked about Sri Lanka, a country in a way victimized by this galloping inflation and so on. Imagine now if a conflict is to erupt in the South China Sea between China and the United States. Is serious conflict because Mr. Xi Jinping's government has said that the sea between China and Taiwan, which they consider a province of China, is all Chinese. I think that's significant because that means that it is quite possible, and I don't know this to be necessarily something that will happen, quite possible that if Nancy Pelosi arrives in Taipei, the Chinese might put forward some sort of military exercise, and that could escalate in a terrible way because she is coming with a flotilla to defend her. Very dangerous times, my friends. Please keep an eye on things. You're with Give the People What They Want, coming to you every week from People's Dispatch. Go visit the site 2-3 times a day. That's Prashant and Zoe, the editors of People's Dispatch. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. See you next week.